And if you want, while we're waiting for people to come in, you can feel free to sort of put your name in the chat and tell us who you are, tell each other who you are. If people don't know each other, it's a way that we can know, like, oh yeah, Tino, he's in my Nazi Germany class or whatever, you know.
I can say hi to Mendel. Hi, Mendel. And Priscilla. It's good to see you again. And Shay.
Hi, Professor.
Shay, that photo or whatever you've got going on, it's pretty terrifying. What's going on there? Who is that?
It's Yzma from Emperor's New Groove.
Oh, a movie I've never seen.
It's really good. Highly recommend.
Cool. Wow. How, Jean-Michel, explain your comment for those of us, namely me, who does not understand.
Oh, Eartha Kitt was the voice of Yzma.
Oh,
basically.
Wow. Amazing. All right. While we're still waiting, I'm gonna just paste some links in the chat for you guys in case you don't know. I mean, I'm sure the fact that you guys are all here indicates that you know what's happening in the history department, but we've got a whole bunch of cool stuff coming up this week. So on Friday, Professor Johnson is speaking more about the presidential transition. On Sunday, Professor Stern is hosting a movie night on Raiders of the Lost Ark. If you want to find out how to come, you should totally email her for the link. And then there's more stuff coming up beyond that. So all those details are on that page, that events page that I've just pasted in the chat. So I think we're good to go now. We have the number of participants now that are registered for the event. I'm sure more will come on in. But thank you guys all for being here. I'm Professor Mancia, obviously. We're going to be recording this Zoom. So if you would rather not be on the Zoom recording, you can feel free to take your video off, but you all look very beautiful. Miriam, no worries about the hair. You're good. Nice to see you. All right, so I don't know, how should we do this? We didn't talk about the order. Should we do chronological order or what? I don't even know. Professor Stern and Professor Remy. What do you think?
It's your call. Chronology is fine with me. But
okay. Yeah, chronology, because I think our media is going to change. It's just my guess.
Okay.
Maybe. For instance, Karen won't be showing propaganda videos, I imagine. No? Am I wrong?
Steve.
I know. Exactly.
Oh, okay.
That's why I'm saying, like, our media will change over time. So we'll move to propaganda and start in caves or wherever we're going to be with you. So why don't you take it away, Professor Stern?
Okay, but I have to say, I changed what I was going to talk about because I realized that while I always love talking about graffiti, it's a lot of fun. Ancient graffiti is always a lot of fun. I was thinking about Steve's topic a little bit, and it inspired me to skew myself in a slightly different direction because the Nazis have to be everywhere somehow. So I wanted to anticipate that bracket in some way. And I guess I can just sort of introduce what I'm talking about a little bit, and then share my screen and share some slides with you. And I'm going to be timing myself because I've been doing so much Zoom today that I don't think I could even count to 10. So I apologize in advance if I slur my words. So I was really excited when Professor Mancia proposed a panel to discuss visual history, because I think it's a great way to think about the very different ways. I guess we're not using comparable media, but the very different ways we can sort of write about history using visual materials. And I actually thought I would start, for those of you who don't know, my research particularly focuses on Jews in the ancient world, very much in relationship to their Mediterranean and Arabian neighbors, also Mesopotamian too at times. And one of the things that I think that here, I'll just share my screen, and it's going to be sort of a messy process, for which I apologize, but hopefully it's a rapid, messy process, and hopefully you guys can see a black and white photo. So the reason why I thought about this is that, so traditionally people have, one of the biggest accusations actually, when put in an antagonistic way about Jews and Jewish populations through time, was that they were a less civilized people because they were a people without art. And this was certainly something that was bandied about, and I'll look forward to any corrections that Professor Remy could offer. But that one of sort of the features that people would point to, and they'd say, oh, they're not as cultured as we are because they are a people without art. And one of my favorite ancient monuments to investigate actually was the first one to so robustly counter that invective, and to a really flagrant degree. So I guess I should start timing myself because I already took up some minutes sort of framing that. And just to say that really this was something that scholars, art historians would often just sort of mention, whether it was in the 19th century or the early 20th century, that the Jews were a people without art. This was sort of a dismissive comment. And part of this related to the fact that there weren't abundant counter examples that were sort of easily available, but it was also in response to an understanding or an interpretation of something within biblical traditions that prohibited the use of images, technically three-dimensional images in representation. And in fact, I will say that this is a belief that Jews never produced art and are people who would never produce art, is a belief that is still held so strikingly that when a few years ago, maybe 2 years ago, I was asked to give a talk to a New York chapter of the American Institute of Archaeology. And when I spoke about this synagogue, somebody got so angry that she stood up and stormed out of the room and insisted that this could not be a building associated with Jews at all, because it was absolutely impossible for Jewish populations in antiquity to produce visual materials. So I'm here to say they did do that. And not only did they do so, but they did so in a way that really helps us learn so much more about the populations who produced this art, if we're going to call it that, this type of visual representation, in ways that we would have otherwise entirely unavailable to us. So today I'm going to show you really briefly, and I have many, many slides, and I'm only going to show you a few of them. I'm actually going to show you images from a building that was discovered in 1932 in Syria, along the border of what is sort of today Iraq and Syria, right along the Euphrates, that was only preserved in its impeccable state because it actually was part of a ghost town that was abandoned and never inhabited after Sasanian Persian attack in the mid-3rd century. So I can only touch upon it here, but one of the biggest problems in general that we have when we want to investigate ancient Jewish life is that we're really limited in terms of our resources, because we do have visual materials and architectural materials. We do have a ton of texts, but those texts come from very particular places and cultures. And we know that Jews lived in lots of different places around the Mediterranean and through Mesopotamia and down through Arabia, but those literary materials don't necessarily represent it. And the architectural materials that we do have can be really limited. So sometimes they're inscriptions, sometimes they're mosaics that are embedded in floors. This one is from a place called Susia, which is near Arad in Israel today. I can talk about any of these later if anyone cares. But basically what happened in the 1930s was that people started excavating this plateau called Sahalia. And they realized that it was the border of an ancient town, and you can see sort of the boundaries here that didn't have to be fortified along the Euphrates because it was along the Euphrates, and around these sides it was indeed fortified. Why does this matter for us? It matters because what ended up happening is that the periphery of the town particularly was sort of padded with an architectural fill that inadvertently preserved the types of artifacts that we would love to have from other places throughout the Roman Empire, because this town was indeed incorporated into the Roman Empire sort of serially through the 1st and then 2nd century CE. And we have remarkable finds that were, again, inadvertently preserved. And you can see them when you can, if you ever want to travel to New Haven. A lot of these, they're either in Damascus or they're in New Haven at Yale University, which participated in the excavations. And one of the things that we know about this place is it was also severely looted. It was partly excavated in the 30s through the 20th century. They resumed excavations at the beginning of the 21st century and then abruptly abandoned during the Syrian Civil War. But you can see here the periphery of the town, and you can even make out the city grid with streets and this sort of thing. Here are some other shots of the town along the Euphrates, and this is where it is today. Okay, so it's a lot of preliminary information because I want you to know exactly where this is, and then I'm not going to have as much time to show you the slides, but I hope they'll be sort of suggestive to you. So here you can see some of the greatest hits of the eastern region of the Roman Empire. Again, at least as we saw it in the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd centuries CE. Dura was founded after the sort of by Hellenistic dynasts, but it's a really interesting town in many ways because there was nothing intrinsically remarkable about it aside from its preservation, but it was really at the crossroads of lots of different cultures and empires, sort of the Hellenistic kingdoms in the east. It had been overtaken by the Roman Empire. The Persians, the Parthians, and then the Sasanians were constantly pushing westward. They're trying to get rid of the Romans, but also there's a lot of Arabian influence from the south. So it's really a crossroad of cultures in this one little town. So this is where it is. We see where Antioch and Edessa are. Those are the other big Syrian towns. I'm going to skip over these. This is the city grid. So if you could imagine it from what we just saw, it's actually very well mapped out. The upper part of the city had been overtaken by military barracks in its later years, but for our purposes, I'll show you this. Now here in what's called L7 in the grid was discovered a synagogue. This was really unexpected. One of the things about Dura that's amazing is that you have lots of different temples to pagan gods. There's even the first ever Christian building archaeologically attested and known right around the corner from this guy. But here was a synagogue. The synagogue, when they discovered it, you could say, why was it so well preserved? And this is what it looks like. It was actually lifted and brought to the Damascus Museum once it was discovered. It was the pride of the Damascus Museum until 1967. But why was it preserved to such an exemplary degree? I will show you. And this is actually from a diagram within a Hebrew publication. But here you can see, and I think you can see my cursor, this was the mud brick wall of the city. Mud brick walls are sort of flimsy. Battering rams, especially Sasanian battering rams, are really good at knocking them down. So what did they do? So in antiquity, people built right up against the city walls, basically, and the synagogue was one of those buildings. What they did was they filled the space between the outer part of the city wall and the sort of the assembly hall of the synagogue. They filled it with sand or dirt. And they did this so that the Sasanians couldn't come and just knock down the wall. But inadvertently, what they did was they basically bolstered the almost entire portion of the assembly hall of the synagogue was artificially filled with dirt. So instead of collapsing, like most ancient buildings do, due to abandonment, misuse, reconstruction, or earthquakes, especially in this region, it preserved it to a remarkable degree. And only because it was built where it was it so well preserved that 70% of this assembly hall was found intact. And if you look at the line here, and this is a photo, as I said, of its sort of reconstitution in the Damascus Museum, where it stands today under lock and key. It is not on the map of the museum. And you can follow the line of collapse. And if you were to follow along, you would see that it sort of slopes down because the dirt sort of slopes against the wall, if this makes sense. Remarkably, not only were the painted the walls were painted, that is remarkable. They're the only walls like this that are preserved from any synagogue in antiquity. It was probably reconstructed in the early 3rd century CE. So it was destroyed by between 255 and 257 CE, but also its ceiling was preserved and graffiti on its walls as well. So I just want to give you a few examples of the types of things that we can see from the walls that we otherwise would have absolutely no idea about if we did not have these images preserved. Really, nothing. We would know nothing. One thing that we know is that for some of you who might be able to recognize this already, is that these paintings are actually representations of scenes from the Hebrew Bible and other similar texts. Marginally, seasonally here, we have stories that are associated with the holiday of, let's see, I went backwards instead of forwards, Purim right here. The story, it's sort of Mordecai being led on a horse by Haman. Some of you might know that story, some of you might not. Here we even have nudity. This is a representation of Pharaoh's daughter who has lifted the baby Moses from a basket. This is one of my favorites down here, sort of the reconstitution of daily, if any of you know the story from the Bible about the Valley of Dry Bones that sort of resuscitate and form humans yet again. You can see all of these little parts of bodies that sort of join together into human form. So these are sort of details of many of these images that I'll show a few of you. You will note here, so this is the image that I mentioned before, which appears to be the figure of Haman, the evil Haman, pulling the horse of the king, and on the horse is the character of Mordecai. I don't really want to fill this in right now because it's not as important to this particular point, but one of the things that is really interesting about this is that this is a story that was supposed to be set in Persia. And one of the most fascinating features of this is that we see that people have visited this painting and written all over. It looks like these figures are tattooed and there's writing all over them, but the writing is in Persian. It appears that Persian visitors to this structure, that people would visit the structure who were not Jewish and were not necessarily participating in Jewish ceremonies in the structure. And the Persian people who visited were told that this is a scene about Persia, and they particularly sort of painted their messages on this wall, not as a form of desecration, but actually as a form of veneration, appreciating the beauty of the structure. This seems to have been a particularly renowned building. This image that I show you is much clearer from when it was painted originally than it is today. The story about the degradation of these walls is really tragic, but I won't talk about that right now. That's an entirely different thing. And some of you might recognize, if you know your biblical stories very closely, that this doesn't exactly represent what we see in sort of the Masoretic or written text today. And that is because it is a particular form of interpretation of a biblical story, much like you find in rabbinic literature where stories are interpreted in one way or another. This is a type of visual interpretation of biblical narrative. How do we know that these are biblical scenes? Well, first of all, they seem to align with them. And other of these scenes are sometimes even, they have labels on them, particularly scenes. This is a scene of Moses parting the Red Sea. The Israelites actually look like Roman soldiers, and the Egyptians are drowning in the middle of the Nile. And I think I'm probably short of time. I just wanted to show you a selection of these. This is actually a label for, Moses's brother Aaron. This is a rendering of his name in Greek up here, and it appears to be sort of a functioning view of the temple, which did not exist when Aaron was high priest, but be that as it may, we have sacrificial scenes. One of my favorites here is the representation of this sort of showdown between the Ark of the Covenant and the Philistine statue of Dagon, who's found dismembered here. So far, there are two big points, two big take-home points that I want you guys to see. One, that most certainly, and discovery like this tells us that Jews, in fact, were a people who had art, if we're going to call it art, which I would probably prefer not to, but for a shorthand, we can do it. Second, we see that this space was decorated in a way we never would have imagined, with interpretations of biblical stories all along its walls. So we know that they're interpretations. We also know that this was most likely a way that people learned about stories from the Bible. They learned about them visually. We know in later periods, this was a way that Christians would teach converts about Christianity as well, to do so in visual ways, because not everyone could read and write. Somebody has recently argued too that stories that particularly integrate images of children do so in lower registers so that children could recognize themselves in the Bible too. And just super quickly, I probably have, well, do I have no time or 30 seconds? Okay. One of the other amazing things about this building, and this is something that I did write about a few years ago and no one had, which was totally weird to me, is that the decorated ceiling of this structure also was found intact. The wooden beams were not, but the decorated terracotta tiles were. And if any of you go to visit the Met, you can see some of these floating around there in the Near Eastern section, and they're still there. So this was sort of the upper surface of the synagogue. It included Greek and Aramaic dedicatory inscriptions and really fanciful creatures like birdfish and goatfish, as one would find. And they also, most of the goatfish are smiling because they're really happy up there. Two of my favorites here are these. These only survive as drawings because a lot of the other ones were lost. And these are very traditional in the region, images of the assaulted evil eye. This is probably the most anodyne version. You can see lots of violent ones where the eye is being attacked by lots of different critters. We also see a lot of different types of graffiti that are prayer graffiti that were preserved from the walls. So again, the take-home lessons, what would I say? One, as I said before, this was certainly a type of artistic production that was very much associated with worship in antiquity. Two, maybe I forgot the order, yes, two, that these images were a form, and you can ask me about this later, you don't really have to believe me, I'm just saying, and my timer just went off, that this was a form of interpretation, visual interpretation that adorned the walls. Three, it suggests that people wanted to adorn their places of worship riotously with lots of color in sort of a transformational way. And four, that graffiti in this place, whether it was by Jews who visited or by their Persian neighbors, was a way that they worshiped and engaged with the building as opposed to disrespected it and sort of denigrated it. So I know that that's a whole lot more than I should have said, but it's just to represent how much richer our study is of this type of tradition with these visual materials than without. Thank you. Apologies for running over.
No apologies necessary. That was fantastic. All right, so Professor Stern, you set me up really well because I talk about that commandment against graven images. And so that's awesome. Okay, I'm going to share my screen now. Make it happen. Okay. All right. My computer is giving me the beach ball of death, so hopefully it won't freak out completely. Okay, can you see it? You're good? All right, so I'm Professor Mancia. I teach and study the Middle Ages, so the period between 500 and 1500 in Europe. And I study medieval Christianity, and specifically medieval monastic Christianity, so the Christianity preached by the most elite, the most educated people in the Middle Ages, and the people who had the most time to really explore and invent Christianity, right? Christianity, if Jesus dies like around 30 something, right? Christianity is being invented then in the Common Era, and still in 1200, it's still being invented before it completely calcifies in the late Middle Ages, and then everything goes downhill. So that's what I'm interested in. And in order to do this, you need to use art to understand their lives in a similar way that Professor Stern just argued. And I'm particularly interested in writing a book. I am writing a book in monastic meditation right now. And so I'm interested in how we can use art to understand the process of medieval monastic meditation. And that's what I'm going to talk about here in this talk today. So the question when you're studying monks, or when I'm studying monks in the Middle Ages, is how did monks reach God? So monks were constantly asking this question of themselves. I've given you here an image of a monk sort of very obviously trying to reach God here on the right. But there were also other images that monks would use to sort of represent this kind of struggle and process, like this labyrinth of Theseus and the Minotaur, which they used to sort of represent their struggle, the lots of dead ends and whatever that they would take in this journey to reaching God. And for many years, scholars answered the question, how did monks reach God, by saying, not with art. And the reason why they said that was because Bernard of Clairvaux, one of the most famous medieval monks from the 12th century, has a whole treatise about how monks should not be looking at art, that true monks spend time with their books more than they spend time with images. And this is in part because he's a reformer who's hearkening back to the Hebrew Bible and saying, you know, there's a commandment against graven images, people, that's not what we should be doing here. And so he says in this treatise, everywhere in these monastic churches, there are so astonishing a variety of contradictory forms that monks would rather read in the marble than in books, and spend the whole day wondering at every single one of these art objects than in meditating. Bernard really sets up the idea that art is counterproductive to meditation. And he goes further in a very famous passage saying, like, for instance, in the cloister, so the monastic complex has at its center a cloister, so a four-sided arcaded covered walkway, the central quad of the monastery basically, but is also the schoolroom of the monastery. It's also the place where monks would often sort of have their sort of independent reading time, if you want to call it that, right? Anachronistically, it's a place where they would probably be meditating. So Bernard says, in the cloisters, before the eyes of the brothers while they read, what is that ridiculous monstrosity doing, an amazing kind of deformed beauty and yet a beautiful deformity? What are those filthy apes doing there, right? And I've given you here a capital from the Cloisters Museum in New York that has apes exactly on the cloister capital. And that's because these capitals in these monasteries had apes all over them, and all kinds of fantastical creatures that completely confused Bernard and seemed to be distracting from the practice of meditation. Now, this is the kind of question that's important to ask as a historian, right? Should we believe what the text is telling us, or should we use the art and with the support of other texts to understand what's going on here? And if we think about the parapet of the cloister, so the sort of pedestal that these columns are coming out of, where the pots are here in the cloisters in New York, this is where monks would sit and listen to their teacher standing up here talking to them about whatever, theology, biblical exegesis, whatnot, right? And if you imagine yourself in class, right, you're not always staring straight ahead at your teacher, right? You're often sort of daydreaming and looking to the side. And what catches your eye as you sort of are daydreaming, it's these monsters, it's these beasts. So historians spend a lot of time thinking about these monsters as actually focusing mechanisms, ways of redirecting monastic attention by saying, ah, got you. Look at these like lewd creatures. That's what you're going to be. You're going to be sort of filled with sinfulness if you don't spend time looking at the main text that we're dealing with. And so this idea of using these monsters as focusing mechanisms then shows up in monastic manuscripts as well. So this is the main text of the monastic manuscript. This is the place where the writ of God would be, right? But then around the text are all of these marginal creatures that are doing things like farting through a tuba, right? You know, things that don't make any sense for monks to be hanging out with, right? But all of these sort of lewd images are meant to distract in order to refocus. So this is sort of my answer to Bernard. So maybe actually these monkeys are there as part of monastic meditation. But then we ask the question, even if these monkeys are there to focus the monastic meditator, how does surrounding a meditator with chaos and sin help the meditator see God, right? So one of the things, if you've taken my classes, you know that I often rhetorically say us, the we, as if we are all monks. So you're gonna forgive me if I do that, because I'm trying to get you guys into the spirit here. But William of St. Thierry, another 12th century monk, responds to this idea and says, okay, well, actually what is within us, meditation, let's say thoughts, is benefited by no slight degree by what is around us when it is arranged to accord with our minds and in its own way correspond with the ideals we have set before us. So William is here arguing that actually what's around us helps us to shape what's inside of us. And one of the ways that we can see that working is that you see in meditative spaces in the monastery, like on the right here, or in monastic manuscripts that are supposed to encourage meditation, lots of scenes of chaos, right? You've got all of these beasts sort of eating each other, right? A lot of disorder over here. And one of the things we could say is that these scenes of chaos actually stand in stark contrast to scenes that later come in these monastic meditative manuscripts that are actually scenes of order. So these are called carpet pages. They've often confused historians and art historians, like what is the point of wasting all of this parchment, spending all of this parchment on a cross or on this sort of like very beautiful geometric squiggles, right? And the point here is really to absorb meditative attention and to stand in contrast with the chaos that is going on, right? And focus it into the sort of order that is imposed by the cross, let's say, and by God. And so this idea that God is somebody who orders the world, somebody who created the world, and somebody who creates literally symmetry in the world and meaning in the world is something that's then being imparted by these images and is imposing a kind of calm on the meditator. And that same kind of effect is then seen in other meditative spaces in the monastery. So on the right here, you have a 12th century Cistercian abbey where you see really the same kind of geometric principles at work, right? The same kind of symmetry, a kind of hypnotic series of arches in the ceiling, right? All of these beautiful sort of directed, focused light by the altar space in the church. All of this seems to create geometric calm where there's otherwise chaos. Same thing here. This is one of my favorite monastic manuscripts. It seems to be a bunch of jumble of letters, right? It's like the chatter, the blah, 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 blah is going on around you. And that inside of that chatter is highlighted like a kind of word search, a poem, sort of poetic verses about the sort of power of the cross, right? So again, sort of like healing geometry in the sort of landscape of chaos. So we have that kind of thing happening with images to facilitate meditation also. And this connects to what becomes very explicit in the late 12th and early 13th centuries, that God is a geometer, right? That he's a mathematician who literally drew the world using a compass, etc. And this is also sort of emphasized then by this monastic manuscript, where you have on the left side page a Latin phrase that says, "This visible image represents the invisible truth." And if you look at this image here, right, you have again a symmetrical understanding, but this is really reflecting what William was saying before, right? That what we see visibly actually is reflecting what's going on inside, what's going on in a sort of invisible truth in God around these monks. But that still sort of leads us to the question, right? Okay, invisible truth. Intellectual understanding is one thing, but actually meditating is hard. And monks would often sort of plead in their meditative treatises for other monks to spend time really bringing prayer and meditation down to the embodied level, to the level of their, quote, still undeveloped souls. So monks, right, as I said before, the most elite, the most educated, the guys who had the most time to pray in medieval society, and yet they still thought that they were in the, quote, elementary stage of sensory imagination. imagination, right? That they said, you know what, why don't you help me out, God, here, because I need some mental picturing because I'm still at stage 1 here. And then William St. Thierry again here says, it was not the least of the chief reasons for your incarnation, for Jesus becoming man, right? And walking and being able to be seen on this earth, right? That your babes in church who still needed your milk rather than solid food, who are not strong enough spiritually to think of you in your own way, might find in you a form not unfamiliar to themselves. So monks are saying here, right? We're not able to reach you fully, God. Your majesty of your divinity is too much, but why don't you give me something that I can grasp, that my pathetic human lowliness can understand and cleave to, a truth that I can picture. Okay, so how do they then use pictures at this level of meditation, right? Well, one is that monastic manuscripts often model what you're supposed to do with your body, so that when we look just at the text of a meditation or a text of a prayer, we're missing the embodied dimension that was prescribed to go along with that prayer, right? Different stages of the prayer, different kinds of prayer required you to put your body in different positions. But even cooler, I would argue, is the way in which monks would interact with their art. William here in this meditation says, asks God, right, will you allow my soul to embrace the manger of the newborn babe, to venerate the sacred infancy, to caress the feet of the crucified, to hold and kiss those feet when he is risen, to put her hand in the print of the nails and cry, my Lord and my God, right? These sound like they're metaphors, right? I want to embrace God, but they're actually literally describing what monks would do with a lot of their interactions, or in a lot of their interactions with art. They would literally hold and kiss the feet of a sculpture, or put their hands in the print of nails of Christ. And so these are sculptures that were in a 12th century Catalonian monastery that were life-size deposition group sculptures. So you can see how big the people are here. When in the Middle Ages, these guys were actually on the floor and you could walk around them and interact with all these characters and imagine that you too were at the feet of Jesus when he was being taken down from the cross. We also have a lot of images that might even be out of reach of medieval monastic viewers, but also suggestive of tactility, suggestive of doing this kind of interacting with medieval sculpture. So that you have this scene where Jesus tells one of his apostles not to touch him, even though the apostle wants sort of tangible proof that Christ is resurrected and that he has a wound. And this image here, you see that the artist has created very prominent holes in Christ's feet, so that again, the sort of the depth of those holes, the sort of highlighting of those holes allows your mind to imagine touching them, even if they're all the way above your head. And this desire for tactility, specifically in medieval sculpture, is interesting because medieval monks believed that touch was actually the highest sense on the route to God. That vision, seeing, is just on the bottom rung here, but every sense is going to propel you upwards, and touch is going to propel you the most, in part because it's the thing that you really can't get with God. It's the exact opposite, right? You want to grasp God, you want to hold on to God, you can't do that, right? So tactility sort of heightens that desire in you. And those of you in Professor Stern's senses class are totally into this right now, I'm sure. Okay, so the bottom line here, were monks awesome expert prayers? No. So despite all of this trying, despite all of these visual tools, it was still hard even for them. So even though they did the embodied stuff, they would still say, ugh, my soul is consumed with longing, right? They would still say, the more I search, the more I thirst. As long as I am meditating, that's as long as I am suffering. And so the final thing that art often expresses is this difficulty and is this struggle and longing. So how does art do this? So one of the ways it does is that when you represent a monk, in worship, in devotion next to Christ, you often don't see him looking at Christ, right? This monk is looking out at us, not up at the image of Christ. This guy looking and grasping, interestingly, the bottom of the cross, but not looking up to Christ, right? The inability for the monk to fully obtain the divine vision is there in the art and sort of teaching us through the images. This is one of my favorite techniques, right? To have the worshiper on the left side of the page and to have the gully of the book between him and Christ, right? So again, that longing, that desire that is not consummated is expressed through the medium of the manuscript. And again here, right, you have a nun desiring to pierce God with a dart of love like Cupid, but she's not penetrated his side wound, right? She hasn't reached him yet. That longing is not fulfilled. And we have some fabulous sources from the later Middle Ages of nuns who are constantly wishing that they could touch the crosses hanging above the altar, right? If you look, here's a concert at the cloisters where people, even if they reached their hands up, wouldn't be able to touch the feet of Christ. And so we actually have nuns saying things like, he is too high for me and too large in size. I can't grasp him, right? So the way that one walks around this space and lives with these art objects is dictating one's meditative emotion. Because in the end, these manuscripts often express, you can't see the face of God, right? You can see Jesus, you can see the Holy Spirit, but you can't see God the Father's face. You can see God's peaks of God, right? His hands, his head, but you can't see his full vision. You can't see his full body. And so when we as historians, right, look at things like Bernard of Clairvaux, who says that all of this stuff, right, the enormous height, the unnecessary width of churches, right, are catching the worshiper's eye and drying up his devotion, we have to, as a historian, say, actually, if you look at how this art is functioning and how people interacted with it, it's really not serving to dry up their devotion. It's serving to stimulate their devotion, and their devotion is dry despite the stimulation of this art. And that very thing, right, that the art captures the longing and the suffering and the struggle of these monks in meditating is the thing that I find so amazingly beautiful about looking at this stuff, because it really captures an emotional experience that these monks had in doing the sort of prescriptions that otherwise seem pretty cut and dry in text. And that is it. Okay. Thank you. So Professor Remy can take us into the 20th century here.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. And thank you to Professor Mancia for organizing this. Professors Stern and Mancia have shown you some very beautiful images. I am not going to show you beautiful images. But I think you probably already got that figured out. I teach modern European and German history at Brooklyn College, and I'm currently finishing what, as far as I know, will be the first English language and biographical encyclopedia of Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler and Nazis have been on my mind for that reason. They've been on my mind for other reasons in recent years. If you're a biographer of Adolf Hitler, any biographer of Adolf Hitler faces a number of daunting challenges when it comes to analyzing sources. And one of them involves disentangling what can be reliably known about Hitler as a person, as a politician, as a dictator, from what historians call the Hitler myth. And that simply means a manufactured public image of Hitler as a heroic figure. Okay, but it gets even more complicated. We also have to disentangle what can be reliably known about Hitler from decades of misinformation and outright apologetics. And a lot of this misinformation has to do with Hitler, the person, right? So his family background, his physiognomy, his sexual orientation, his sexual preferences, his health, his drug use. And some of it has to do with the development of his ideology. and the nature of his rule. So one very important example would be the question of when and where and how did Adolf Hitler become an anti-Semite? All right, that's just one example. And if all that weren't enough, like any other historical subject, the way that we think about Hitler is influenced by contemporary contexts. So it isn't just a matter of quantity of what we know and how much we know, but how the world around us influences how we use that information. It goes for any historical subject. That said, let me get back to the Hitler myth. The main purpose of the myth was to legitimize Hitler's claim to total and unchallengeable political authority. I'll get to images in a second. So when you do this, the myth will conceal the highly unexceptionable reality of his past. And more to the point, the fact that he was a human being like other human beings. I mean, given Hitler's importance, it's easy to forget that he spent over half his life in total obscurity as a nobody. Now, saying this is not saying that he wished to be worshipped like a deity. He did not. But there is a quasi-religious dimension to the myth and how he wanted people to respond to it. The foundation of the myth is actually not an image. It's his memoir, My Struggle. But this book is only the beginning. Visual imagery formed a critically important part of the myth. And here's where historians and students of history can get really led astray. So let me share my screen finally, and we can look at some images. Not here. Okay, is that working? Okay. All right, now, Hitler and his very powerful propaganda ministry went to great lengths to manage his public image. And Hitler had been doing this since his earliest days as a politician. He was capable of devoting hours of intense work to his speeches and to how he appeared in public. And you're looking at a couple of series of photographs that were never made public when Hitler was alive. They're from 1925. He's 36 years old. He's practicing his performances. And these photographs were taken by a man named Heinrich Hofmann, and Heinrich Hofmann became his official photographer. Well, these are, I can see why he didn't want them published when he was alive. He ordered Hofmann to destroy them, and Hofmann did not. Now, there's another one worth calling your attention to, and this is wait a minute, I forgot. Oh, there it is. This is a famous photograph, also taken by Heinrich Hofmann. It's August 2nd, 1914, in central Munich. This crowd is reacting to the news that Germany has declared war on Russia. And years later, Hitler told Heinrich Hofmann that he had been in that crowd, and Hofmann said that he dug through his negatives and he found Hitler's face among the crowd. Historians now consider this photograph to have been faked. Well, how do we know that? Well, for one thing, Hitler didn't look like that in 1914. The suit is wrong, the mustache is wrong. There's the position of his head. It doesn't work relative to other people in the photograph. And then there's the timing of when it was published, 1932. And the short of it is that was a moment when Hitler's patriotism was being questioned by his political opponents. Now, we don't have a negative of the image. Now, that in itself doesn't prove forgery. We have several prints of it, and in each one, Hitler looks a little bit different. Now, there's no reason to doubt that Hitler did claim that he was in that crowd. There's no reason to doubt that he was not. The historian Thomas Weber recently discovered a film clip of this location in Munich at some point during that day, in which a man who resembles Hitler can be seen. That's not the same as this image. finding the original negative would settle the question definitively. This regime, the Nazi regime's myth-making machinery, was so effective that historians find themselves in a rather difficult situation when it comes to the visual record of Hitler. So let me get to one of the main points that I want to make. And that is, with very few exceptions, every time we see an image of Hitler, film or a photograph, we are seeing him as he wished to be seen, with very, very few exceptions. And this presents a considerable challenge to biographers. I mean, what we make of the propaganda is one question, and another is, can it tell us anything about who Hitler was, who Hitler actually was? All right, now that said, I do think it's possible to overstate the distinction between myth and reality in one sense. And I suppose this would be another point, big point I would want you to take away from this. I would argue that when Hitler performed, and that meant whether he was subjecting his entourage or regime officials to endless monologues, or whether he was giving speeches or posturing at one of the party's gigantic annual rallies, he was also performing for himself. He was performing for Hitler. It seems inconceivable to me that creating and repeatedly performing this myth would not have an impact on him himself, how he saw himself and how the actions that he took. A simpler way to put this would be, I think to some extent he came to believe his own hype. His megalomania, his self-certainty was not just a pre-made character trait. It didn't come out of nowhere. It was built and it was maintained. And imagery played an important role in that process. So that's one way I think that we can use all of this manufactured imagery, this Hitler myth, as a way of understanding Hitler the person, Hitler the politician. Now, there's another pitfall historians consider when we look at images of Hitler. When he entered political life in 1920, he developed a highly theatrical style of speaking, and he was good at it. And it marked him out from other politicians, and he devoted hours to writing his speeches. The form and the content could have the effect of whipping up audiences into sort of gales of self-righteous anger. And soon he was the party's most popular speaker and then its leader. But the impact Hitler's speaking abilities had on early recruits to the party, particularly those who became his closest officials, should not be overstated, because they were all deeply saturated in the culture of the far right before they ever met him. People like Heinrich Himmler, Hermann Goering, Joseph Goebbels, Alfred Rosenberg, Martin Bormann, Rudolf Hess. Okay, fine, but what about just ordinary Germans who went to go see him speak? The majority of Germans who joined the party or voted for its candidates in the 1920s did not do so because one day they went to go hear Hitler speak and they became mesmerized. There's compelling evidence that this kind of on-the-spot secular political conversion experience did happen to some people. But much more often they experienced a version of what Hitler went through back in 1919 when he was directionless and trying to stay in the army. They found a political home. They found a political home for their resentments, for their anger, for their fear. And they could be very easily swept up in the emotional experience of a Hitler speech, even if, as was often the case, they couldn't hear what he was saying. But being swept up in that mobilization of emotion that Hitler and the Nazi propagandists were very good at, I think is really needs to be paid attention to. And this image that you're looking at right now is a product of Nazi propaganda. But the ecstasy expressed here, the young woman at the right center of the photograph in particular, has always caught my attention, as the older gentleman on her left, I think, Uh, uh, this ecstasy here strikes me as entirely authentic. Okay, now I would venture a guess that the single most common set of images that of Hitler found around the world to this day are taken from a single film, and that's Leni Riefenstahl's film, The Triumph of the Will. Now, I was going to show you a short selection. I found out recently that YouTube has taken it down from its site for reasons I think you can probably guess. I have a DVD of it, but it doesn't play here on screen sharing, so I'll just show you some stills. As you may know, Leni Riefenstahl was a brilliant and ambitious filmmaker who ingratiated herself with Hitler. The party commissioned her to make a documentary film of its 1933 annual rally in Nuremberg. She made a conventional newsreel style film, and Hitler was pleased. So he asked her to do another one, a film of the 1934 rally in Nuremberg. This time, she was given practically unlimited resources, all the money she wanted, total freedom. And in that context, what that meant was that she answered only to Hitler and a huge crew. The result was Triumph of the Will. And I could talk at great length about this film, but for our purposes, I'll only say this. Riefenstahl, who died at 101 years old in 2001, always claimed that she did nothing more than film a thing that happened. Now, she in fact made an extraordinarily influential work of visual propaganda. And her technical innovations are absolutely legendary. She won prizes, all these international prizes for the film in the 30s. Filmmakers still study her techniques. But her claim that this was just footage of an event was demolished in the mid-70s by one of her most brilliant critics, and that was the American writer Susan Sontag. Sontag argued that Riefenstahl didn't just record reality on film, but she actually shaped reality to suit her medium and produced a distinctive fascist aesthetic, as Sontag called it. Now, you know, anytime anybody criticized Riefenstahl in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, she tended to do things like sue and, you know, become very angry. But I think Sontag's characterizations were spot on. And I think the technical virtues of Riefenstahl's film really confounds a comforting claim that propaganda produced by totalitarian regimes never amounts to anything more than mind-numbing kitsch. But here, Triumph of the Will may be the exception and not the rule. Hitler was overjoyed by this film, and it premiered in Berlin in 1935, became the most popular film in Germany that year. And in case anybody was wondering, no, nobody was forced to go see it. Neither Riefenstahl or any other German filmmaker during the dictatorship made another film of this kind. And that suggests that Hitler held it to be the ultimate visual expression of the movement, as he would have called it, and of course, more importantly for him, his role as its leader. One more interesting example, if I have time. Well, here's another still. And another very famous shot. That is, where's my cursor? That's Hitler here. No, here's here. Anyway, a good deal of these parade grounds are still survived the war. They're outside Nuremberg. Another interesting example are the so-called home movies. In 1936, Adolf Hitler gave his girlfriend, Eva Braun, a silent 8mm camera for her birthday. And some of the footage, most of what she filmed was of herself and her friends, but some of the footage was of Hitler at the Berghof. The Berghof was his home in the Bavarian Alps. And American intelligence agents found the reels at the end of World War II. But recently, I think that one's doctor. Never mind. I should have included that one. Recently, some researchers have used new software that reads lips to try to find out what Hitler was saying. Well, it's not very interesting. He says nice things to children. He talks to Ava about her dress and about the films that were shown in the Berghof every night. At one point, he tells her that, well, if it were up to you, we'd only watch Gone with the Wind. It's tempting to conclude that, oh, well, these are Ava Brown's home movies, and Ava Brown was actually more powerful than I think a lot of people really understand, and more significant, and not this sort of vacuous appendage of Hitler at all. But here, since there was no expectation, certainly that these films would ever be made public. It's tempting, I think, to think, well, here we see the real Hitler. I think it was the BBC that even did a whole television series on these, right? The real Hitler, Hitler at home. But for me, I think they serve as more evidence that that the line that existed between the public and private Hitler was blurry at best. Hitler was always performing, and that includes among his inner circle at the Berghof. I'll just wrap this up by saying that the Hitler myth reaches the height of its influence from 1933 to 1940. There's no question, especially in the pre-war years, that Hitler was genuinely popular among those Germans who were not targeted by the regime's enemies and outsiders. And that this popularity was not simply a result of Germans believing the regime's propaganda, because Hitler had destroyed the left, and he destroyed the Republic. He restored full employment in 1935. In the minds of millions of Germans, he returned Germany to greatness by rearming and by shredding the post-World War I peace treaty, which most Germans resented very deeply. And despite the fact that most Germans did not want another war, he and his temporary ally, Joseph Stalin, destroyed Poland in 1939. And then in the spring of 1940, he reaches the height of his popularity when the German army defeats France in 6 weeks, defeats the larger French army in 6 weeks. So I think the accumulated power of this myth carried into the first years of the war. And it only begins to seriously degrade as the tide of the war turns against Germany in 1943 and defeat becomes inevitable. And just one more thing, it's important to note that the version of Hitler Germans saw in the 1930s was gone by the last years of the war. Hitler had retreated from public view. He was becoming increasingly physically debilitated, yet still very much in control of the regime. But the image from the 30s, the Hitler myth from the 30s was all but gone. Okay, so thank you all very much. I'll stop right there.
All right. Thank you, Professor Remy. So we're going to open the floor up to questions, to comments. There's some great stuff already just in the chat. Priscilla, I don't know if you want to talk about Orwell or anything like that, but the floor is everybody's. You can raise your hand, you can put something in the chat, whatever you want to do.
Can I jump in? First, I want to say thanks to my colleagues who I learn from every day. Guys, I'm Professor Napoli. I'm right now the chair of the department, and I'm privileged and to have these smart people as my colleagues and my teachers. I want to point out at least one or two things that I heard that connect all of these presentations. One is that each one of our presenters talked a little bit about the way you have to pay attention to the physicality of the visual medium. It's not just something that comes through the eyes, but it actually has a tactile reality that matters a great deal. Professor Stern talked about the archaeological elements of the work that she has done, and the way that accidental preservation has mattered a great deal to what she's been able to learn. Professor Mancia has talked about the sense of tactility that is embedded in the worship that she studies. And even Professor Remy talking about the need to find a physical negative to demonstrate whether or not a particular image is real or not, points up that even in our contemporary world in which images are absolutely literally everywhere, our lives are littered with Instagram and TikTok and other things, they very often start in real tactile elements. So the physicality of things is one thing that all pointed to. The other thing is to pay attention to other sources to help make sense of visual sources. That visual sources don't speak by themselves. You have to apply the traditional techniques of a historian to make sense of this material, right? It's not as though you can simply approach pictures and statues and whatever and expect them to talk to you about what they mean. And the third, I suppose, is that we also have to employ our critical sensibilities, right? We always have to be thinking hard about what these things mean in the context in which they were created and what do they mean now. And that requires an ongoing engagement with the field and with our disciplines and with the other people who write and think about these matters. So I want to say, first off, thank you to the three of you. You guys probably know I'm thinking about these matters too, and it's a pleasure to learn from you in this way. Thank you.
If I could just respond to the comment I saw in the chat from Priscilla, the artist propaganda by George Orwell, and I'm a big fan of George Orwell, so you don't need to convince me. But you also mentioned The Great Dictator, Charlie Chaplin's film from 1940, and I think about it for a couple of reasons. One of the ways I thought about going in this presentation, I could have gone in a number of directions, and one of them was to have made it about satires of Hitler. And there's a new book from my colleague at NYU, Ruth Ben-Ghiat, Strong Men. She specializes in the history of fascist Italy, and it's a book I recommend strongly to you. It's about the idea of strong men from Mussolini to Donald Trump. One of the many points she makes is the extent to which real authoritarians or would-be authoritarians cannot tolerate being mocked or satirized. Of course, if you actually have a functioning dictatorship, you try to do that at your own risk. Chaplin made the film outside in the United States. And I think it's still one of the great satires, perhaps the greatest Hitler satire ever made. There's a lot of them out there, and that's a tradition that goes back to at least 1940, satirizing Hitler, and all the way on up to Taika Waititi's film Jojo Rabbit from a year ago, the most recent in a long and distinguished tradition of satirizing authoritarians.
I don't want to prevent other people from talking, so you can feel free to interrupt me and jump on in. But if there aren't comments, I'm going to ask a question, which is that I think it's interesting. I mean, as somebody who studies the pre-modern, right? And Professor Stern, I wonder if you would agree, right? The the amount of evidence that we have, right, is much less than you do for modern history. And so the imperative to study visual sources feels like maybe it's even more intense than it would be for modern history. And I wonder if that's true. I mean, it's certainly, I think, Professor Stern, in your work, you talk a lot about how people just ignore graffiti and visual sources and favor textual sources because of the rabbinic tradition and whatever. But I wonder, I mean, like the modernists who are here, even like Professor Wills, Professor Napoli, Professor Troyansky, right? Do you think that people more easily ignore, maybe at their peril, right, in the modern world, visual sources because you guys have diaries and newspapers? Or, you know, do you think that that's not true? Or Professor Will says lots of stuff, not all of it significant. Totally. I mean, students even, right? Like, do you feel like when you're studying pre-modern stuff, you're looking at more sources that are visual or more diverse types of sources than later because there's just so many sources in the modern period? Is this a boring question? I don't know.
I think it really depends on the subject matter too, right? So Professor Napoli teaches pop culture, and that there's a lot of visual sources, right? This semester I'm teaching surveillance society and culture, and we're going to look at the panopticon and other sorts of art, surveillance kind of art, right? And so I don't know, but I think probably because we have more information, not all of it significant out there, maybe we do tend to discount the importance of visual sources more. I don't know.
You know, I'm having trouble distinguishing between what I do with early modern visual sources and modern ones. And in part, it's about, I guess, the way my teaching has evolved over time, that sometimes what I do is I like to put an image up and talk about it and not present a kind of traditional sort of lecture. And so, you know, that's a pedagogical issue or a stylistic issue. I don't know. I think with the early modern stuff, it's a way of getting people to feel in some sense what that other world is. It's about the foreignness of the past. And I think, Lauren, you're maybe getting at that in the, you know, within your question. And yet for contemporary stuff, images, films, just the look of something still matters, I guess. One thing I was thinking of in listening to the three of you was the way it's not just what you as historians get out of this material that's different from what you get out of text. It's also that we as listeners and readers have an opportunity to feel what it's like to be surrounded by all this stuff. So with the first two presentations on history of religion and all kinds of other things connected to that, it's what does it feel like to be part of that world? And I think with Steve's thing on images of Hitler, it's also what is it like to be in a rally, or what is it like to consume news in visual form. So there's a kind of it's not just about your method, it's also about how your readers or listeners grapple with this stuff.
And I think, sorry if you're going to say something, Steve, I think that Professor Napoli's point is a really important one. I mean, how we interpret the materials. I mean, I think the big danger, of course, is that you see an image and somehow it feels more immediate and more authentic and somehow more intuitive. Like we just know what's happening there and we just know what they mean. And I think, however arresting some of these images might be, the question is, you know, how to interpret it responsibly so that we're not just projecting ourselves into the past. So on the one hand, there's the advantage. I mean, I'm all for the idea of I mean, the reason why I like the synagogue I talked about so much is because we have a sense of it in a full 3 dimensions. I mean, that's extraordinarily rare. So you can try to sort of plot yourself in that space and sort of look around and experience the space. But at the same time, the challenge is to say, okay, but I am not there, you know, and how do we, the challenge of interpretation so that we aren't just projecting, but trying to learn. I mean, I think that's the big challenge, but it's really wonderful to see this expressed in so many different ways, and hearing how you do this and how you approach teaching it, and to hear how Professor Wills teaches with these materials as well.
I think one of the most famous examples of that, right, in medieval stuff, right, is that there have been generations, and I mean, in fact, the history of reading race in art in general, right? There have been generations of scholars who have interpreted medieval buildings, imagining them to be not painted, right? And indeed, when I fell in love with medieval buildings, I fell in love with gray stone, right? And when I see recreations of what they looked like in the periods that I study, I think they look gauche and horrible, and I just want to sort of put them from my mind, right? And so there's a romanticism about what the Middle Ages felt like, and that danger is more prominent, I think, when you're dealing with faces and visual stuff for the reasons Professor Stern just gave. So yeah, I think that's a great point. And then, so famously, right, lots of folks in the Renaissance, interpreting Renaissance art, sort of used Renaissance art to elevate ideas of white supremacy that seemed to be coming from ancient culture, when in fact ancient marble sculptures were painted, and painted often the colors of people of different races. So there's some very famous articles about art coming out right now in this exact same way, misinterpretation based on how it looks now.
One of the things I struggle with, and this was another direction I thought about going for this presentation, but decided not to. Anybody who teaches this period, and especially the history of the Holocaust, has to confront how to deal with some really extraordinarily disturbing images. It's a common misperception, even to this day, that the Holocaust was a kind of secret while it was taking place. And questions, well, did Hitler give an order or not give an order? Hitler said he was going to, Hitler announced that he was going to murder the Jews of Europe in public. And then the Nazi regime repeatedly said publicly that it was in the process of murdering the Jews of Europe. None of this was a secret. The operational details were supposed to be a secret. But we do have records of photographs of shooting operations in places like Ukraine that I regularly struggle with in terms of showing in classes. And that's not because I think my students are somehow delicate and they can't take it. That's not what it's about. It's more that part of me says these have to be seen because this happened. Holocaust denial is a widespread phenomenon globally. It's probably getting worse. This is one of the most important records we have of what historians now call the Holocaust by bullets. Perhaps 2 million, perhaps a third of the total victims of the Holocaust killed in shooting operations in Eastern Europe. But on the other hand, I think about the dignity of the victims and what intellectual, what pedagogical purpose does showing these images serve? And I don't have a clear answer to that question. But without fail, every single time I have to teach this, I find it very painful, very difficult, and I will show some. I do, because this impulse to document, to record, to relate, to show the truth it ends up being paramount, but I find it profoundly uncomfortable doing so.
What's especially wild about those images, usually they're shot by German soldiers, right? Private soldiers are a common source of that kind of material. So it's the impulse to document was present at the time. And paying attention to the source material, once again, the literal physical sources, where did it come from, matters a great deal. The history of soldier photography is one of these problems. Like the impulse to document atrocity is one of these. Yeah, I just had, sorry, I had to jump in because I've been reading about this problem, right?
Yeah, and I'll just say quickly, since Lauren asked whose eye is behind the lens, that's a great question. If anybody's interested, just today, Wendy Lauer, an American historian of the Holocaust, who's written about the Holocaust in Ukraine, she's written about women as perpetrators. Her book, The Ravine, just came out today, and she came across an extraordinary series of photographs about a shooting operation in Ukraine in 1941. Not only did she track down she did this years of research into these photographs, and not only she found the actual camera that was used, and she found out who took the photograph, and the perpetrators and the victims, and I think it's going to be a very, very important book. It's Wendy Lauer, Lower, The Ravine, and it just came out today.
Thanks, Professor Remy. Any other comments or questions? If there isn't a picture, it didn't happen, Shay said. Mm-hmm. Fascinating, yeah. Yeah, for sure. It's what makes pre-modern stuff so tough.
I guess I have a question kind of building off of Professor Remy. There's so much of history, or popular history, is sort of like it can border on sort of like, I don't know what the right term would be, but almost like war porn, or just like a lot of violence and bloodshed and gore, and you know, incidents where, you know, it'll just be this many hundreds of people died, and that's just the sentence, you know, and you move on to the next thing. Like, do you all find yourself with a similar, because even though there may not be the photographs like the Holocaust where you really see the individual's face, but still do you struggle with, like, how do you teach certain events, or how do you approach certain topics, I guess, that's sort of open to everyone?
That's a hard one. I mean, how do you teach the Middle Passage? How do you teach the entire history of imperialism and colonialism? How do you teach any genocide? Yeah, it's very difficult. I mean, I keep coming back to that tension between the needs to document, the need to document, the need to try to convey the enormity of a crime, and this feeling that you're just going to be numb, or you are engaged in some kind of pornography in the sort of, you know, strict definition of that term. That's a hard one.
Because there can be, you know, there may be documented evidence. Like, there's so many history podcasts out there today that get really into the gritty, gory details of personal accounts, and sometimes a lot of times I feel like that's not always necessary to tell the story. Sometimes it is, when you're really trying to convey the brutality of something, and other times it feels just a little bit for show, sort of abusing the situation for, which is common in so many areas of everything today, a lot of entertainment.
I mean, just to, you know, I am thankful that I don't have to deal with this issue with a problem that is so alive as something like what Professor Remy is dealing with, right? But I think that even even when dealing with the pre-modern world, or perhaps easier when dealing with the pre-modern world. You know, one of the things that I often spend time asking is, what is suffering? What is the use of suffering? What is the use of gore? What is the meaning of that gore for these people, right? That, you know, I mean, as Shay's saying, right, like, there's a use of all of this gore today, right? For us to know, for us to remember, for us to make political points, whatever, right? But one of the things that's fascinating to me is like, why all this suffering? I mean, you heard all this suffering in the quote, the text that I was quoting, right? So what does suffering mean, look like, feel like in the Middle Ages, and how might that be different from how it feels in the 20th century is just a fascinating question, I think, but perhaps I have the luxury of it being fascinating because it's so far in the distant past. Not sure.
I mean, I think I struggle with some of these things that Professor Remy was talking about, particularly when I teach the shaping course, you know, because there are periods of time in which you don't want it to become some greatest hits of horribleness, you know what I mean? I mean, as you were saying, like, what do you do to depict the middle passage? I mean, how gory should it get? Should I show footage from concentration camps and corpses piled into carts? You know, there, I mean, sort of the ethics of presentation is sort of the question. And I think it just has to do with the purpose of it, but just that it's hard. It's difficult. And I feel differently about it every time I teach that course. And as with what Professor Mancia just said, I mean, some of the most tragic things that I can deal with in some other courses that I teach, maybe not the religion and violence course, but other courses where the focus is mostly on antiquity, when people write poetry that expresses mourning, or when the Romans document their conquest of other people in particular ways and need to flip it around, that's much less direct. So it doesn't have to be any less powerful in evoking suffering or pain, but at the same time, it doesn't have the same documentary gaze, which can feel so direct and penetrating that it can make everybody feel very uncomfortable. But it is a challenge that I think is really intrinsic to what Professor Remy and sometimes Professor Napoli, I imagine, and Professor Troyansky too. I know we were talking about the French Revolution and things like this. I mean, let alone surveillance. I mean, all of these things together, it's an ethical problem in its own way.
When I teach Vietnam, there's no getting away from the Eddie Adams photograph of the execution of the VC prisoner. And there are about 4 seminal photographs, one by Malcolm Brown, the burning of the monk, the one by Eddie Adams, and another one from Kent State. You can't get away from these pictures because they in themselves become, absent the gore, the image itself in 1963 or 1968 or 1970, the image became so powerful that it's as a vehicle for a motivating political action, that's in some cases visual images are the story. And it's not, you don't want to use them gratuitously, just as Micah was saying, but the goriness was powerfully motivating at the very moment the image was taken. I think I agree with Professor Remy that we're all balancing these things, but sometimes it's just unavoidable.
In that context, I find the decision of the family of Emmett Till, who was murdered in Phil, somebody help me out.
55.
Yeah, for those of you who don't know, a young black boy from Chicago visiting family in the South who was tortured and murdered, and the family decided to display his very damaged and decomposing body in an open casket for a political purpose, and it served that purpose, actually. But I see a hand up. I don't want to.
I'm afraid I think
Proceed.
Priscilla has a
Yeah.
right?
Hi. No, you can finish, Professor.
No, I'm done. Please.
So I was just wondering here about all this information, and thank you so much. And I was thinking about a event that happened last year with George Floyd, when everybody, actually the event was filmed. So I don't know if all of you professors want to answer this, but what do you think it's going to be the future for history teachers with this kind of tools like videos and images? Like, it's a bunch of things, different things for nowadays.
Professor Wills, do you want to say something about this? No, it's good. It's fascinating. This is very connected to what Professor Wills is teaching right now. Do you want to give us a tidbit?
Me? I think you're the special guest. You should. I just put that in as something to think about. I'm not sure it gets at Priscilla's larger question.
Well, Professor Stern, what are you going to do? You're going to teach shaping. You're going to have to bump into this, I imagine. I'm curious.
I think it's really interesting. This was something that we're talking about in, I think it's all a big Zoom blur, my day. But today in the Religion Through the Census class, we were sort of talking about the challenges of an abundance of data versus the challenges of paucity of data. And I think this just weaves everything together. And I was saying how in terms of documentation, or what seems like documentation, okay, both Professor Wills and Professor Mancia's comments notwithstanding about the documentary gaze, I mean, I think today we have so many different ways that we can document, that the challenge is, well, there will be twofold. One will be, will the technologies in which we document remain as durable as we think they are, to the point that they will remain accessible? So, we feel like everything is documented in an exemplary way, but if, digital media becomes defunct, it could all be lost at the drop of a dime, and we'll have much less information than we think we might. But it's really hard to sift through, because we don't necessarily know what the gaze is of the person who is behind the lens, whether it's behind the lens of the phone or behind the lens of the camera. And that makes it hard. But so we could have an enormous amount of data to sift through, right? With what I was mentioning today specifically, we're sort of contrasting, the information people have about responses to the Black Plague versus the pandemic today, where we have journaling projects and we have all of these modes of documentation. So will all of this actually be lost once these technologies are of yesteryear? Or will we be faced with such an overwhelming mass of material that it's just going to be really so hard to sift through in a way that doesn't entirely reflect only the imprint of the viewer, only, not the limited. I mean, those are my basic musings, but Professor Wills.
I will jump in because those of us who have even done 21st century history, right? It's the abundance of evidence. But I just want to say something as you're thinking going forward into your own careers, whether they're teaching or some other field. This is the skill we teach and we have ourselves learned. I put it in the chat earlier. There's a lot of information out there, not all of it's significant. And part of becoming a proficient researcher is to be able to sift through that and look for trends. And by the way, I have a lot of floppy disks with stuff I don't even know what's on them anymore. If any of you want to see them, because we'll never be able to read them. But the other thing to know about, I think that's important, is even though there seems to be so much information, historians are always dealing with fragments in the historical record, and some things will be lost. Some things will be deemed, we've got to purge that cloud empire at some point. And there will be archivists out there who say, well, this isn't very interesting because it was the Brooklyn College History Department stuff or whatever it is, right? So you're going to have similar challenges that we have. It's learning how to, that's why we assign so much reading, is to make you better readers and thinkers from that reading. You don't have to read every word in a book. You have to know what the thesis is, the evidence, right? The structure, all that stuff. The same is true of all the sources you're going to find out there. So sorry,
But just to continue this conversation, I wanted to say two things. One is that, right, archivists right now are trying to think about, like, how do I archive Twitter? How do I make it searchable, right? Those kinds of questions are the questions that archivists ask, right? And then the other thing that I wanted to say was that the way that we see is also very dictated by the moment that we live in, right? So that the way that medieval people saw, I mean, down to the optics, like how they thought seeing worked, changed the way that they made things, changed the way that they saw them, changed the way that they interpreted them. And the way that we see, I mean, if you think about even the way my daughter sees at 5 versus me, right? The way someone used to sort of scrolling through TikTok or whatever sees, as opposed to people who grew up in the 50s with television sets, right? All of this impacts the way we produce the images, the way that we interpret them. And those are historical mindsets also that we have to think about, right? So the Vietnam soldiers had a different mindset from the Nazis, had a different mindset from the people in Dura Europus. And we have to consider all of those questions when we archive and when we interpret as historians. More questions, more comments?
I just think one of the things that Phil Napoli said earlier about the sort of 4 images that mattered most, they indicate the way early on certain images become iconic. And I'm reminded of a couple of months after the George Floyd murder, I had an email exchange with a friend who lives 2 blocks from where the murder took place. And she had taken some photos of the site, which had become a kind of shrine. And I was struck by the fact that her photographs weren't quite the same as the ones that I was used to seeing, because we're used to the one with the mural on the wall and flowers and so on. And yet this was something from someone in the neighborhood taking a somewhat different angle, and it was kind of jarring, but it's not the image that's going to be remembered. And yeah.
And I think that's a great metaphor for what we're trying to do also as historians, right? Is see the stuff, whatever that stuff is, from a different angle and not from the iconic angle, or to question, as Professor Remy did, what produced the iconic angle, right? Yeah. Any other comments, questions?
You guys were talking about like goriness in like visual representations, and like you can see that with like movies about slavery or the civil rights movement, where it's like it's very in your face, the violence that occurred during that time. And I think it's more of is trying to make us feel bad about that thing happening, that way it doesn't happen again. So the goriness is necessary in like some way. That's pretty much my comment.
That's great. And I think that that's a motif in some ways, that's a technique that's old. Medieval people in the later Middle Ages depict very, very gory images of the crucified Christ to make the viewers feel guilty about the fact that he had to die for their sinfulness. It's a quite different and yet also very similar issue. So, anything else? Totally, Jean-Michel, right? Again, the question of who's behind the lens, right? I mean, and Professor Theo Harris has written a lot about images of Rosa Parks, right? And how they were created, curated very carefully to misrepresent, that the ultimate result was a misrepresentation of who she was. Yeah, cool. All right, well, I think we've all been Zooming since 9 a.m. or whatever. I think we're ready to turn off our eyes or whatnot. But thank you guys for coming. There's a Discord virtual lounge that the history department has. There are more events to come. Hope to see you on Friday at 1 or Sunday at 7:30. And thanks so much for coming. Have a good Tuesday night.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Good night, everyone.